The rest of the approach to the hive ship passed without incident. At least, as far as us passengers were concerned, that is. The pilot definitely had to dodge a whole lot of something over the last few minutes, though. Thank the Emperor, Tink never turned the vid feed back on. At a word from the pilot, Sergeant Rebus and his 4 scout marines sprang out of their seats and positioned themselves around the vortex bomb. A few moments later, there was a squishy impact and the stealth shuttle's rear door opened to reveal a pulsating wall of fleshy stuff. The scouts painted it with something, Rebus stabbed it with his power sword, and a gap was pried open. To our disgust, the 5 Marine boarding party then smeared themselves with the juices running from the gap. Once they and the vortex bomb were good and covered, they pulled on some camellia-lined cloaks that looked far better than any that had ever been issued to us lowly guardsmen, and climbed through. Sergeant Gravis planted a probe-looking device in the gap behind them, and then sealed it with some big staple things and some chemical spray. When the gap was closed, we heard Gravis and Rebus do a comm check and schedule the pickup. Then the shuttle's door silently closed and we started drifting away. From docking to undocking, the whole boarding operation took just under 5 minutes. It was the most impressive display of efficient professionalism we'd ever seen, and I'm not sure any of us drew a breath during the whole thing. We all prayed to the Emperor that we wouldn't have to be on the shuttle during their pickup. There's a moral about getting what you wish for in there somewhere. We descended to the planet alongside the hail of spores spewing from the hive ship. It went a lot faster and required fewer evasive maneuvers than our approach had, which was good for our frayed nerves. Now that Sergeant Rebus and his team of suicidal supermen had departed, Gravis and his scouts became a little more chatty. The scout piloting the shuttle brought the gravity up enough to keep us in our seats, and told Gravis that he was starting scans. Gravis brought out an oversized data slate and began staring at it with the other scout. They didn't seem to think that we really needed to take part in the discussion, but when Tink sent his drone to hover over their shoulders, Gravis decided it was easier just to let us participate. Gravis and his 2 scouts were searching the battlefield below us for signs of zoanthropes. Specifically, they were looking for big old bolts of warp lightning which could be traced back to the Xenos Psyker firing them. That sounds fairly simple, but given how far up we still were and how much of a mess the battlefield was, we decided that it was pointless to try and help. While the Marines strained their eyes, the rest of us concentrated on the sort of things us lowly guardsmen find important, namely weather, terrain, and hostile positions. These turned out to be acid rain, wasteland with giant spiky rocks, and everywhere. In short, it wasn't a place we wanted to go anywhere near, much less drop onto via gravshoot. Nubby and Tink started the argument by complaining about the suicidal nature of the mission, and suggesting that we just lie on the report, which prompted the Scout Marine to tell us to grow a backbone and a proper sense of duty. Amy told him where he could stick his backbone and sense of duty, and things went downhill from there. Sadly, there wasn't time to get a real good fight going. We only managed a bit of name-calling and a few anatomically improbable threats before Gravis finally spotted some warp lightning. Sarge, Doc, and Twitch stared at the data slate with the Marine. The section of battlefield he was looking at was a complete free-for-all between the orcs and nids, and a particularly dense cluster of jagged rocks was emitting bursts of lightning. Gravis said that the frequency of the bolts indicated it was a lone psyker, and went on to point out that the position was not strongly defended against an airborne insertion. He suggested that we move on the target immediately, before it was killed or the battle shifted. But Doc and Sarge didn't like that they couldn't see inside the pile of rock the Psyker was hiding in. And Twitch was Twitch. Sarge asked Gravis how sure he was that A, there wasn't a whole hive's worth of nids in there, and at Twitch's insistence, B, that the lightning-shooting Xenos wasn't actually an orc. Gravis just glared at us and said he was 73% certain that this was an acceptable target. Our fearless leader tried to stare down the Space Marine for about 5 seconds, then decided that this sort of decision, not to mention arguing with the Astartes, was above his pay grade. Sarge rounded on the rest of us and started bellowing orders to prep for deployment. Tink got spot stealthed up and verified that our scopes were synced. Nubby and Amy flung a final few insults at the Scout Marine. Doc tried to remember which button was which on his grav chute, and Twitch angrily grabbed a last armful of explosives while muttering about no one taking orcs seriously. When everyone was ready, we formed up behind Sergeant Gravis and his scout. A few minutes later, the shuttle hatch slammed open. The Space Marines stepped out into the air and dropped out of sight. Sarge followed him to the edge, looked down, and froze as he saw just how far down and covered with pointy things in Xenos the ground was. Then the Scout Marine pushed him. Now, just to be clear, while there are entire regiments of Guardsmen dedicated to doing grav drops, the rest of us think they're insane. Even your average catechin will call an Elysian, or any other type of drop trooper, an adrenaline-hungry madman. And mind you, that's coming from someone who would gleefully try to kill a war boss with nothing but a combat knife. I mean, who in their right mind flies all the way to the battlefield in a perfectly functional shuttle, then drops out of it while it's still half a click off the ground? Anyway, dropping through the ground towards a pile of rocks that resembled nothing so much as a giant demonic hedgehog was not on the list of things we joined the Guard to do. The fact that there was a hostile Psyker inside said rocks, not to mention the bloody melee of orcs and Tyranids around them, did not make it any more attractive. If it wasn't for the fact that Sergeant Gravis was already on the ground and clearing our landing area, we all would have stayed in that shuttle. Also, the Scout Marine kept pushing us. Despite how unpleasant we found the drop, the painfully direct training we'd received meant we all made it down in one piece. One piece doesn't mean cleanly, though. Only Sarge and Nubby made what could be called good landings. And that's only if you count landing on an unsuspecting orc and Hormagaunt as good. Doc and Amy wound up colliding with each other in the air and made an awkward dual landing on one of the jagged spires. Amy managed to stick the landing and started picking off targets, but Doc wound up sliding off and bouncing to the ground like a terrified pinball. Tink outright stopped his descent by having Spot come up under him. He happily shot into the melee from his perch until a flesh borer to the leg reminded him that hanging in the air, where there is no cover and everyone can see you, is a terrible idea. Luckily, he landed next to Doc. Twitch did not hit anything, but he swerved around a lot for some reason. Sergeant Gravis had cleared us a beachhead, and those of us who hadn't gotten shot or cracked a rib on the way down widened it. That was our first chance to use the pulse weapons Tink and Theo had designed for us on soft targets. And it was glorious. No heresy intended, but Tau carbines blow lasguns out of the water. They hit harder than a hot shot and reload easier too. We were dropping nids and orcs left and right, and it was gratifying to see Sergeant Gravis stop and stare at us when he ran out of enemies. The Space Marine didn't stop for long, or ask about our sexier-than-standard issue weapons. Once he was sure we had the perimeter on lockdown, he switched to his power sword and made his way to the cluster of fallen spires that was occasionally illuminated by blasts of lightning. The scout, who was perched similarly to Amy, and had stolen at least 3 of her kills, started following his boss by jumping from spire to spire. The official plan called for us to leave them to it. We were just supposed to secure a landing area for the shuttle and keep reinforcements out. We were doing far better than expected, though, and Sarge started feeling all, I'm this big Inquisition guy who helps instead of just following orders. So he followed Gravis to lend a hand with the Zoanthrope, and Twitch tagged along for his own reasons. The rest of us were more than happy to stay put and just keep shooting any orcs or Tyranids that wandered our way. Looking back, holding that perimeter was far too easy. There was never a concentrated attack on our position, just the occasional Xenos who retreated in our direction or was checking out what all the plasma fire was coming from. We thought that the Xenos were just keeping each other busy. The Tyranids weren't pouring in to reinforce their psychic artillery unit because the orcs were in the way. We didn't realize that something had gone wrong until Sergeant Gravis flew out of the side of the rock pile. Well, not flew exactly. More like was thrown. Something like 1.5 tons of power-armored space marines sailed through the air like a thing that is very bad at sailing, crashed through 4 of the smaller rock pillars, and barely activated its grav chute in time to dodge a fatal collision with the larger 5th. Doc tried to ask Sarge what the hell just happened, but our fearless leader was busy screaming, swearing, and firing his pulse carbine on full auto. When Doc tried again, Twitch cut in, and in a slightly hysterical tone told us that Sarge was busy right now. He suggested that anyone who wanted to live should get some cover between themselves and the rock pile. We didn't need telling twice. Since we were keeping our heads as far down as was anatomically possible, and it turned out that Sarge was half blind and Twitch wound up getting a nasty concussion, no one really saw what happened next. Luckily, Spot recorded the whole thing. A few seconds after Twitch's warning, he and Sarge came out of the rock pile at a dead sprint. They dove behind the first pillars they could find, and a split second later, the entire cluster of collapsed pillars exploded. 3 green glowing projectiles were propelled out of the hole Sarge and Twitch had exited, and splattered apart against the rock Amy was perched on. One of them, or a piece of debris, must have clipped Twitch's pillar too, because a sizable chunk broke off the top and nailed him in the helmet. He managed a dazed, told you so, before collapsing. In the aftermath, Doc ran over to check on Sergeant Twitch. The rest of us kept our eyes on the perimeter, except for Amy. She descended from her gore-covered perch with a cry of, "Oh God, it's everywhere. I think some got down my shirt. Tell me this isn't mashed Tyranids." Sarge blearily sat up and told her not to worry. It was only smashed orcs. This did not improve Amy's mood. Sarge calmed Gravis, verified that both the Marines had survived the blast, and made sure the shuttle was on its way to pick us back up. While we waited and shot the occasional orc or nid that took an interest in us, Sarge explained what had happened inside the rock pile. Sarge had followed Gravis down a sort of tunnel that headed towards where the warp lightning was coming from. The Space Marine had been sprinting ahead and had obviously intended to rush the Psyker with his power sword before it could notice, and fry him with lightning. Sarge caught up just in time to see Gravis exit the tunnel and pull off the close to melee range part of the plan. but the Xenopsyker hadn't been the frail ranged support unit they'd expected. Instead, Sergeant Gravis wound up face to face with a big ol' psychic, not to mention psychotic and psychopathic, orc. To the Space Marine's credit, he hadn't hesitated at all. He'd waded right in and started chopping and stabbing while Sarge gave covering fire. Unfortunately, the weird boy had a bunch of bodyguards, and they bought him enough time to do some warpy stuff. Sarge said the moral of the story was, if a warp energy-infused orc charges you with supernatural speed and a big glowy stick, it is a far better idea to dodge his swing than to try to block it with your power sword. So, when the Space Marine got knocked out of the park, Sarge decided it was time to leg it. He'd made liberal use of flash grenades, and nearly ran into Twitch on his way out. Twitch had apparently been picking out the detonators for the det packs he'd, without bothering to tell anyone, dropped all over the rock pile on his way down. Anyway, Sarge had held the weird boy and his surviving minders off long enough for Twitch to sort out which buttons he wanted to press, and they got out of the rock pile seconds ahead of the explosion. The orcs hadn't, which was why Amy was picking pieces of them off her armor. Sergeant Gravis and his scout rejoined us just as Sarge finished his story. Nubby, ever the diplomat, asked if their bug hunt had gone as well as our perimeter securing had. Amy and Tink snickered, but Sarge shut the three of them up. The two Marines didn't look like they were in any mood for bullshit. Between the acid damage and the new set of dents and scratches, Gravis's armor was beginning to look rather ragged, and the scout looked even worse. He'd apparently been trying to find a hole in the top of the pile to snipe through, and didn't have the same hardwired response to a warning from Twitch that us Guardsmen did. His stealth cloak was completely ruined, plus there were at least 2 sizable holes in his carapace armor. He was still alive, though, and rather rudely turned down Doc's offer to patch him up. So we figured he was fine and had learned an important lesson about warnings from demolitions troopers. The stealth shuttle dropped out of the clouds above us, and we got back into the air without further incident. All of us more or less collapsed into the oversized seats. Despite the fact that we'd only been on the ground for about 15 minutes, and only 2 of us had been noticeably injured, we were exhausted. Our rest didn't last long, though. Despite the perfectly reasonable suggestions some of us made concerning calling the mission off and pinning the blame on Mr. 73% certain it's an acceptable target, Sarge and Gravis both immediately started searching for another Xenopsyker.